So what I'm going to try to do is to take you through some of the history that I lived through, but from the perspective of learning disabilities, which in my beginnings were mainly called dyslexia. And again, how many people here live in Fairfax County? Well, Fairfax has suddenly revived the term dyslexia, and they have dyslexia teams, and I'm consulting to them. It's interesting because for many, many, many decades, dyslexia was a verboten term in public schools. You could say reading disability, but you weren't allowed to say dyslexia due to the fact that dyslexia had a lineage that came from neurology, from medicine, and schools felt, I think justifiably, a little bit queasy about using the term, but it's kind of been resuscitated. But anyway, so I'm going to sort of take you through this historical journey because I think it elucidates this relationship between LD and ADHD and in what way are they related. And that is partly in need of going historically because before 1980, there was no term ADHD, and there was precious little emphasis on anything but the hyperactivity. And so things were viewed very, very differently. So there was a conference in 1966. It was a government-led conference where they came up with this term minimal brain dysfunction. Interesting enough, it's my initials, Martha Bridge Denkla, which was pointed out to me. I gave a talk for some speech language pathologists, and they presented me with a pin with my initials, and all of a sudden, the lady who was doing it burst into laughter, as I did too. But this was a term that was cooked up in order to cover a broad swath of children who had normal intelligence, but they had a little this and a little that and a few glitches here and a few problems there. And so what they were trying to emphasize in that era was that they did not have what were called psychodynamic or emotional problems. So it had hyperactivity, minor motor anomalies, perceptual problems, and dyslexia. Then somebody picked up on the perceptual problems, and that sort of morphed into learning disabilities. Believe it or not, in the state of New Jersey, where I got my start, first there were classes for the neurologically impaired, i.e. those with minimal brain dysfunction. Then there were classes for the perceptually impaired, and then it became learning disabilities. So over about 15 years, it kind of migrated. And again, as I said before, people outside of very selected few people, like in what used to be the Orton Society that became the Dyslexia Association, people didn't use the word dyslexia. It was considered to be outside the educational purview. It's interesting because I was just reflecting the other day that we talk about developmental language disorders. Nobody has clung to calling them dysphasia. Some people cling to dyspraxia, but believe me, in a developmental context, it's extremely difficult to define. And of those three terms, dysphasia, dyslexia, and dyspraxia, probably dyslexia is the one with the most justification for being revived. But the other two are very muddy when you talk about children with developmental problems rather than an acquired problem. So there was the actual legislation that came out in 1975. So you go from 66 to 75, and you have this public law, which, as you know, has been revised several times. And this is 5 years before the term ADHD was born. Hyperactivity was actually shoved over under emotional, behavioral, psychiatric. So if you had these different boxes to tick for an IEP, an individualized educational plan, LD would be over here. And then you had over here another box to tick if the child was hyperactive, and it was considered under ED, emotionally disturbed. So these are interesting things to contemplate upon, because what's in a name and what's in an interpretation before you have much research. And there were separate organizations. The organization to deal with hyperactivity, which later became ADHD. We have the organization CHAD, which still exists, and LDA. And I remember in the early 80s when I was on the board of the Learning Disabilities of America Association, that there was a child psychiatrist, I won't name names because you would recognize him, who was saying, we have to be sure that we don't have anything to do with this ADHD business. That's not our kids. Our kids are over there in this other, neck of the woods, taken care of by Chad. So there was a feeling of turf. And the psychiatrists felt that even though they no longer were conceptualizing ADHD as, quote unquote, an emotional psychiatric thing, they still had ownership. And my own professor, Norman Geschwind in Boston, with whom I trained, and who was very happy to see me work on language disorders and dyslexia, when I started to work on ADHD, he accused me of having softening of the brain because I was doing something that he conceived of as being psychiatry. And that'd be a whole other thing, is to talk to you about Boston, where neurology and psychiatry took a long time to even speak to each other. There are these localized cultural things where, you never would have had a joint appointment in neurology and psychiatry there, but at Johns Hopkins, I do. And that has been a long-standing thing at Johns Hopkins, so the culture is a little bit different. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is kind of the Bible of the psychiatric profession, and we kind of go along for the ride with a minority group, the neurologists. There are about, between 7 and 10 psychiatrists for every neurologist. We're a very small minority group, and child neurologists even smaller. So they launched ADHD and ADD, and their organization, which still exists, is CHAD. LDA still exists, but for some reason doesn't have as much oomph as CHAD. But that's a whole other, I'm happy to answer questions about how these lay organizations wax and wane. Now ADHD has candidate neural systems. There's a lot of work been done, and of course having MRI has been the clincher in what I call the ecumenicism between neurology and psychiatry, because the psychiatrists wanted to do all this research with MRI also, and they've done some of the most distinguished research. And so we don't fight anymore about whether it's basically a neurodevelopmental disorder, although very heterogeneous in genetics and, but the point is it's coming from something to do with the way the brain develops. We all agree on that. And we don't think it's from the way you're parented, or same thing happened with autism. Autism was also, refrigerator parents and all this business. And then when you get some way to study children during their lifetime and you have all this new research, you suddenly say, you know what? Maybe the parents weren't the best parents, but maybe they were challenged by having a child who had significant trouble coming along with his brain development. So we have candidate neural systems. I just want to give you the sense that these review articles talk about behavior, cognition, and different parts of the brain. Now ADHD has many, what's called this terrible word, comorbidity. That means some other problem. Morbidity means what's wrong. I know it sounds it's awful, but and you'll notice that pale green, which is good because it's a lab school green, learning disabilities, 46%. So more than 2/3 of children with ADHD have something else going on, and learning disabilities is like almost half, 46%. Speech problems, 12%. Anxiety, another biggie, 18%, and so on. Even conduct disorder. I mean, if I sort of stopped you and I said, what do you think is more common in kids with ADHD, conduct disorder or learning disabilities? You'd probably think of, oh, they're bad actors and they get in trouble, and you'd probably guess that it was more frequent to have conduct disorder, but it isn't. Learning disabilities are by far more common. And there are other, depression also, it depends what age group. If you go into a teenage age group, you're going to have a lot more anxiety and depression than if you look at the children during their elementary school years. Okay, so ADHD and dyslexia are the two most common of the neurodevelopmental disorders, and they co-occur more often than we would just expect by chance. And the most parsimonious explanation is that they partially share some genetic risk factors. And indeed, the correlation between dyslexia and at least the inattentive part of ADHD is quite strong, much more so than between dyslexia and hyperactivity. But then we have to then look at this developmental trajectory, what I like to call localizing in the fourth dimension, which is hyperactivity tends to wane during the lifetime of people with ADHD. So it depends when you get in your snapshot of comorbidity. So researchers have identified a multiple deficit model of what accounts for this overlap between ADHD and dyslexia, in which each disorder has multiple predictors, some of which are specific to each of them and some of which are in that overlap circle. This is meant to be bewildering. I'm not going to go through it, but it's supposed to be showing you that there are these different phenotypes, meaning different mix and match things that can show up in a given individual when you mix up these different. So you have, for example, single word reading correlates with naming speed and processing speed, but they also correlate with some other aspects of attention. You get the idea. In other words, if you sort of look at all of these various cross correlations, there are these internal characteristics within the broad category of ADHD and LD that give you many, I like to call them mix and match patterns. Now we've been studying at Kennedy Krieger processing speed, which is one candidate for a behavioral phenotype. In other words, a phenotype that constitutes core deficits of more than one disorder, a polyphenotype. And the psychological makeup of a polyphenotype accounts for why there should be coexistence of these conditions. And then the genetic architecture, which we're certainly not going to go into tonight, accounts for the correlations between these highly prevalent disorders. But in terms of a commonly used phrase that you hear that's even a part of the modern IQ test breakdown, processing speed is definitely an area where you'll find whichever group you start with, and certainly if you look at the coexisting groups, they'll have trouble. Processing speed means the speed of completing a task with reasonable accuracy, and fluency is a particular kind of example of the ability to read words quickly with reasonable accuracy. Now, poor reading fluency also increases demands on other processes like working memory, and it affects comprehension. These higher level processes compete with the basic decoding mechanism for time-limited resources. So basically, if you're spending a lot of time just making the transaction of sound symbol association, it's going to be hard for the resources in that time frame to also be holding on in working memory and of course the fluency, which is the production of the actual either in your head or externalized flow of the words. And poor fluency creates a cognitive bottleneck. Basically, there is a pathway that goes from the back to the front of the brain. The back is the part that looks like the earmuff over there. That's, for those who like to name drop, it's Wernicke's area. It's the speech sound processing area. And it has to connect to Broca's area, which is the speech sound programming for production area. So basically, as I say to parents who come to see me in my clinic, see it, say it. It's a see it, say it circuit, and it's indispensable for reading. And of course, if it's not myelinated, it doesn't work fast. And also, we've done some recent research in which we find using an even fancier technique that's called diffusion tensor imaging that actually maps out the flow of the water within the axons and tells you what exactly is the anatomical thickness of pathways that dyslexic children tend to have fewer nerve fibers and axons that just go minding their own business from see it to say it, and they have a large group that sort of gets off on an exit ramp into the parietal lobe as though they have an obligatory partialing out towards meaning, which is why so many of them are so smart. And we also get kids who amaze us by reading silently and getting meaning out of what they're reading, but they haven't been able to read out loud. So there's a very crucial bundle here, but strangely enough, if you have an off-ramp that goes up into the parietal lobe, that's above that temporal lobe earmuff, you actually may be a very smart person and you may have fantastic potential for comprehension, but you are not as fluent a reader, especially if somebody has you reading out loud. This is rapid naming, the beginning of rapid naming, which I made up as beginner's luck, these many years ago, and which basically is just see it, say it, see it, say it, see it, say it, using the simplest and most early developing purely visual stimulus that you would have to attach a name to. So the child simply has to, go red, black, yellow, green, blue, black, red, yellow, blue, green, etc. And later we added a card with letters and a card with numbers. And the interesting overlap story here is that children with ADHD will do fine with the letters and the numbers speed, but they will be slow on the one that nobody rehearses with them. So when they have to do something efficiently that looks novel to their brain, they suddenly unmask the fact that unless they make something into a highly overlearned habit, they're not efficient. Whereas the kids with true dyslexia will have the biggest trouble with naming the letters. Of course, if they have both, you're going to see slowness across the board. And this is interesting. This is the interstimulus pause time and the rapid naming. And you see that with the kids with ADHD, they have this flickering response preparation. They spend more time between. They don't get into a steady rhythm. And they are more variable between just that simple task of just saying, red, green, blue, yellow, black, red, blue. They have these pauses in between. And that's what those yellow blocks show, is that the interstimulus pause time before a response comes out is that P equals 0.001. Anybody who has taken a statistics course knows that that's pretty, and we very rarely have samples any bigger than 25 in each group, so that's quite a hefty difference. So it shows you that there's some real biological difficulty in this very basic task, which you would say was processing speed in a particular pathway that is a very heart and soul of reading. And these attentional lapses that we document in kids with ADHD actually predict their reading fluency. So there you get the overlap that you actually, if you start with kids with ADHD who anybody never sent them to you and said that they had a learning disability, you will actually find that they are not up to all of the parameters of really efficient reading. Now, the ancient history of dyslexia, let's jump all the way back to the pure dyslexia. Back in 1887, somebody named Rudolf Berlin saw children with what he called a partial form of alexia. A means blotto, nothing, which means dyslexia to you and me. Dys always means there's something functional, but it's not normal functional, and A means gone. Okay, and he called this word blindness in the children. And then in 1896, another doctor in England this time was the first to say congenital word blindness. And another doctor in 1917 emphasized that he thought it came from the angular gyrus, which is that parietal lobe right above the temporal lobe. And he modeled that on what was seen when people had strokes and lost the ability to read. And you always have to be very cautious because you're sort of in the neighborhood of what happens with strokes, but things don't unfold developmentally, but they're not completely in a different part of the brain, but they're not exactly in the same place in acquired as they are. Now, the visual emphasis, as bespoken by this word blindness, really prevailed for about 80 years, and it still pops up again. You'll still find people with emphasizing the visual and wanting to give visual exercises, or certainly wanting to send people to optometrists. But we must beware, because actually there's very little actually in the visual perception that is important in reading. Orton was a physician, actually a neurologist in New York, and he came out with this theory of strephosymbolia, which would mean twisted symbols, by which he meant what we now talk about as reversals. And he thought that there was a direct competition between the two sides of the brain, and that was the problem, was that the child was constantly flipping between the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere, being the directional signal for which way the letter was to be looked at. It wasn't true, but it again at least was focusing people in an era when people tended to think of anybody with normal intelligence with any problem was immediately sent to lie on a psychiatrist's couch. So it was helpful to the extent that it was at least saying, folks, we're dealing with something, not a hole in the head, not a damage to the brain, but something about the way the brain is organized. So it was helpful in that sense. And it was also, to me, very important, because I teach teachers and educators all the time, and I love the fact that he published it as an MD in an educational journal, which is not very common. So is dyslexia the same as reading disability? Or is it a conceptual clearinghouse of uncertain breadth and depth? The problem is how the signs change with age and development. You know, the simple view of reading is that it has to do with the alphabetic principle being firmly and fluently established, where you see it and you say it. It's at the level of naming letters, the level of giving sounds for letters, and then the level of giving individual phonemes for letter groupings. That's one thing, but a lot of people stick to that, and they think that that is dyslexia. The problem has been that we then get to more complicated things we need to do when we read. This shows some of the early fMRI brain activation patterns. So you look at the unimpaired and the dyslexics, and the main thing you see is an awful lot of anterior activity going on in the dyslexics that you don't see going on in the children. And these are older children. These are 4th, 5th, 6th grade children. And they're using their frontal lobes. They're struggling like mad. And stop for a minute and think. I'll just inject here a little bit. ADHD is associated with frontal lobe immaturity. So you have less to struggle with. We say compensate would be a nicer word. And again, the unimpaired has much more activation in that back part of the brain, which indeed that is the angular gyrus. I mean, to give it to the guy in the previous historical slide who said the angular gyrus is important, because that's a switching station between visual and auditory back there. And so you see in the dyslexics, there's an underactivation of the really efficient switching station in the back of the brain, the visual auditory switching station. Dyslexic readers use compensatory systems. They use a lot of right frontal stuff. But again, we think about our kids with ADHD, they run about 3 years less mature than their peers in frontal lobe development, so they don't have as much on their own to compensate with. So again, there are common genetic influences with shared impact on fluency, which we also call slow processing. And here it says 25 to 40%. When you start with dyslexia, you don't get as high a comorbidity as when in that first chart I showed you with the Chartreuse elliptical thing that I said was 46%. That's when you start from the ADHD population. You get a higher comorbidity. But also, that wasn't just dyslexia, because that would include math and all learning disabilities. So if you start with dyslexia, but sometimes you get as many as 40% within a dyslexic population have coexisting ADHD. And again, I think it's very fraught with the complications of what age is your cohort, and exactly, what are your criteria for that age being diagnosed with ADHD. And again, the so-called inattentive subtype is the greater overlap. Also, developmental motor coordination disorder, which itself is highly comorbid with ADHD, and in the NIH LD descriptions, they list dyspraxia, which I don't like, but it's a synonym for developmental motor coordination disorder, and has a double overlap with both of these groups. That's another overlap zone. So a lot of handwriting problems are seen in both groups, for example. Relationship of dyslexia to language. This is my big thing. Dyslexia, to me, is often the tip of a language iceberg. Now, a lot of children with specific language impairment, developmental language disorder, have reading comprehension deficits. Only half of them will show up in the very early grades as having a problem. I'm talking about the kind of kids where they picked up in Child Find, or the pediatrician picks them up and they go for therapy, and everybody congratulates them that they're at the starting gate with their language. They don't fall into the impaired range. However, although I'm an optimist, I'm also a fatalist. And if you've got a weak language system, it's going to be lying in wait for greater challenges. So you may learn, half of these children, a little over half, will have trouble with learning those early decoding stages of dyslexia, but most of them are going to resurface with comprehension deficits. And some people, like my great protege, Laurie Cutting, who's gone down to Vanderbilt over these many years, call it specific reading comprehension deficit, because we get kids who are quite well remediated and they pass benchmarks in third grade for all of their basic reading skills. And this is where the simple view of reading falls down. So this is the other great strand that feeds into the higher level of learning disabilities, which is where, when you must go from the decoding to the comprehension, you will again have children whose underlying language impairment surfaces both for vocabulary and syntax, both. And we are remarkably insensitive to this, and we've gotten even more insensitive because autism has spread its wings over everybody with a language problem, and people are missing these 10 ways to Sunday all the time. So the heterogeneity of the specific language impairment disorders, plural, because some of them are more strictly expressive and there's a problem with vocabulary. When you think about reading, you can use your decoding mechanism, but you have to make adjustments for knowing that that's a word. And it isn't exactly phonetically correct unless you make those adjustments to a known vocabulary word. So even at that interface between, sound symbol and getting a real word to be there in that sentence, you have to have word retrieval. This leads to the instability of these early methods of response to intervention identification, because we get these kids who are, put into response to intervention and they do smashingly, and then the same thing happens as happened with their language impairment. Oh, we picked them up, we detected them early, we gave them this, we gave them that, and then we get them to be at criterion and we say, have a nice life. Then we do the same thing all over again with the reading, the early simple reading part. We get them up to par by the third grade, and then we say, have a nice life. And then 25% of those kids cannot understand what they're reading. So I'm just showing you that there's a long definition of dyslexia. We won't go into that. Interestingly enough, part of the NIH definition is that there's poor self-expression, meaning expressive language. For example, saying thing or stuff a great deal in your spontaneous speech, and difficulty learning new vocabulary. Now, you know, as you move into the second half of elementary school and on up, you're learning new vocabulary in subject matter at such a pace. Even in literature, there's new vocabulary that you never encountered before. And trouble learning foreign languages, so you get the point, is that even in NIH definition, they acknowledge that there's a broader, deeper language disorder involved. And poor spelling, which is because you have to run the whole alphabetic principle in the opposite direction, and that's where there needs to be more work on visual. I am firmly convinced it's on my bucket list. I won't be able to do it myself, but I hope my trainees are going to carry forward. I really believe that people's visual perception that's immediate for objects is going to turn up in the irregular word spelling in the English language, because it's going to be like the immediate recognition of it doesn't look right, which is very much more complicated. We really haven't cracked the surface on that at all. The fiber of reading. So again, we have language comprehension, which is riding here on top of word recognition. But look, within language comprehension, we have background knowledge, vocabulary, language structures, okay. And then we have verbal reasoning. Here we start getting our input from the ADHD side of things, because whenever you have reasoning, you're going to have a lot of executive function issues that come along with ADHD that kind of jump into the fray. The word recognition, there's phonological awareness, decoding, and then there are these sight words, which are, I think, part of a complex object recognition system and much more related to this irregular spelling system. This is what my professor of pathology in medical school used to call an oh hell slide. Excuse me. So all I want to show you is, this is sort of like, what do you have to do in order to even read something out loud? But what's at the top is attentional processes. You've got those attentional processes up at the top, and you've got integration processes somewhere down below the visual processes. And then you've got, finally, all these motor processes. You've got to feed in the language system. You know, you definitely are doing a complicated duet all the time between attentional, executive, and linguistic gymnastics, as one of my colleagues likes to put it. Again, I want to emphasize, I want everybody to remember this. Reading is the tip of a language iceberg. It's the phonological level at the surface. So here's your iceberg. Syntax kind of hovers, you know, because morphology, which is, do you put an S on the end of a word? If you ever try to learn a foreign language, you know that it's almost like phonology to just remember whether you know, what do you do to make a plural, you know, those kinds of things. And then you have syntax that bears meaning, and then you have semantics, and of course at the base of it all is pragmatics, which means in what context, with what people am I trying to communicate? So, but the reading is going to have to involve all these other things as it moves from a mere barking at print into actually a useful process. And a broader, deeper language disorder involving semantics and syntax will impair your school learning even when the reading appears to be remediated. Okay, so as you go through and you have more and more vocabulary, and the rate at which you have more vocabulary and more complex syntax thrown at you in your education is really much greater than anybody really appreciates. So I think we need a new phrase or a new category called academic language disorder. In other words, where your language may be good enough for the mall, but not good enough for the school. So, and again, just to remind you, you've got visual processes and you've got auditory processes, and then somehow they have to go up to the front. Now you may say, what do you mean go up to the front? When I read silently, I don't go up to the front, but you do. The interesting thing is you take any skilled reader and you have them read silently inside a fMRI machine where you can see activated, and you're not conscious of it, but your speech programming area Broca's is going all the time. It's just not sending the final signal to your lips or to the neurons that govern the muscles that are your lips. But you are always talking when you're reading. Even somebody like me who is a tremendously fast reader, and I said, no, 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 I don't believe it. And they stuck me in there, and sure enough, you know, my Broca's area is going a mile a minute. So yes, there are a lot of semantic and language processes, phonological processes that are going on in the back part of the brain. But reading is actually we think of it as a skill. It actually begins and then goes underground as a motor skill. It's moving your mouth in response to stimuli. And that just shows, again, you can see this is the RAN. You see where those great big, that's Broca's area, is the lower one of those two frontal lumps, the one that's closer to the temporal lobe. Okay, so as we just want to review for a minute, we say that dyslexia has problems with decoding of single words, rapid retrieval, phonological awareness, phonological memory, say cat without k, you know, all the things you do on the CTOP, the test of phonological processing, rhyming, non-word repetition, even repeating meaningless series of digits, although my favorite is having kids repeat nonsense words, which is very sensitive to somebody that's got the dyslexic trait, the phonological one. This is I mentioned before that there's a letter card that is like it's exactly the same model of 5 stimuli repeated randomly 10 times for a total of 50 things. And so this is the letter card from the RAN. Dyslexia can have subtypes: the phonological awareness deficit and the rapid retrieval, the one that the RAN picks up on. But I want to point out to people, awareness, whenever you see a test that's called awareness or judgment, it involves your frontal lobes and is therefore going to be suspect in ADHD because it's going to have that executive component. When you are aware of the phonemes, it means you're taking an analytic, it's not an automatic processing. You're having to take a certain analytic approach to the sounds in words and disregard their meaning. So you're having to do a selective analytic approach, which is really very much more challenging than it looks like on the surface. So beware, any test that somebody calls the awareness of something or the judgment of something, it's got a big component beyond the content of the test, which is how is your executive frontal system going to handle this? And this is, I'm just commending to you the work of Wolf and her colleagues, that basically what it is severe, and I would assume that a lot of the children at the lab school would be in a severe category, have both slowness on the rapid naming and they were very slow to catch on to the phonological awareness. Interesting enough, this comes from educational people. If you look at deficits in reading comprehension, okay, vocabulary and language. Verbal working memory, it's got a foot in 2 camps. It's partially language and it's partially in the frontal lobe. Syntax, language. Inferential thinking, finding main idea, and self-monitoring all are subdivisions of executive function. So you have like 3.5 executive things and only 2.5 language things. And this is some educators' breakdown, and I'll name the name if you want to know later. But anyway, it's not a person with any theoretical grounding in the neurological way of thinking, but that's how it breaks down. It's really more executive than it is linguistic. And remember, executive function is the ability to organize information and check on yourself, self-monitor. And when you get to written expression, you're into tremendous amounts of executive function. Although there too, the content, if you have an idea, you have to have the words to put the idea into, so that's the language part. But then the ability to load up that assembly line all the way from the word that's found in your conceptual search all the way through to the generating of the sentence, and then you have to get it spelled and punctuated and etc. So here's what we had a big study that ran for 5 years, and this is kind of like the results of this 5-year study is reading comprehension. Certainly the simple view of reading has a partial contribution, especially in the younger children, decoding, but I don't know why there are two functions there, it just should be executive function. And so the simple reading assumption has really not been, has not been validated when it comes to getting past and especially nowadays when we have children who really are drilled to it fairly well with the early reading skills through the tremendous acceptance of the idea that we have to learn through phonics. We more and more find that there's a delay in the diagnosis of their broader learning disability in the language arts. So we had that was the name of the study that was, it ran from 2005 to 2011. And it was, I did not call it, because we were doing it in the schools, I decided we were not going to call it the learning disability this or the dyslexia that. I called it the Center for the Study of Reading Disability or Development. And we found that we did all this in the schools. The schools were much happier to have us there when we said it was the study of reading development than if we had that, we're looking for trouble, kind of. So we had to look at this interface between motor and cognitive. Here's one that really stunned me. We have a multi-trial learning test that showed that, here I read you a list, you say it back to me, I read it to you, you say it back to me. I thought that there would only be problems with organization of the lists, but it turns out that the children with ADHD did not retain the verbal information. They didn't just have trouble with the style of learning, they actually had trouble with the learning, period. So again, that's an overlap because it's verbal learning, so of course the language-based learning disability kids would have trouble. And you can see academic difficulties immediately, or sometimes, as I said, things will emerge later, which is one of the problems with this whole business of response to intervention, is that people have this simple view that if you put your foot upon the path and you seem to be able to do okay for the first 10 steps, that when the path gets steeper uphill, that you're still going to have no trouble. And that just does not always work out. So you already heard that color naming was slower in children with ADHD, and we're repeating this a little bit. I think I'm going to leave this out because it's terribly, terribly complicated. But this is some of the fMRI things that we do in order to see how quickly somebody can switch from one discrimination to another. And basically, the kids with ADHD show a greater bottleneck. In other words, they need more recovery time as they switch from one task to another. Working memory, we did an fMRI study, and we found again that children with, this is actually with letters of the alphabet, so it's kind of verbal material, but children with ADHD have trouble with the verbal working memory. If we look at the whole picture of working memory and reading comprehension, we do find that there's plenty of unexplained variance, but that working memory does account for at least a significant sliver. But so does attention. So again, they're both members in the ADHD. These are just some of the attention. As we increase working memory demand, everybody has a little more trouble with a task. But the kids with ADHD, you see, have got a bigger gap when you increase working memory demand than do the others. Again, so we find that there's anomalous brain development and function in ADHD with lots of deficits in executive function, which involve response control, working memory, and processing speed. And we like the working memory and processing speed emphasis particularly because we found that teachers, let me put it this way, they think they've heard those words before. So they don't get so turned off by your explaining it to them. And these are highly relevant to the speed and efficiency of reading, writing, and remembering, meaning learning new, largely verbal information in school. So the implications for those children who have ADHD and may not have tremendous behavioral problems but are having learning problems is to consider these invisible factors that contribute to cognitive load. The motor, for example, the amount of energy that goes into the writing. There's more aversive conditioning to even doing schoolwork or homework from the kids who have trouble with pushing their writing implements around. And also try to reduce the competing demands on these different loads, especially when you are trying to get the task done this is where the rationale comes for let's not have so many timed things. In other words, because processing speed is this common denominator across our LD and our ADHD and our co-existing, that the need for speed is something we really have to de-emphasize. And we have to reduce demands from multitasking. Written expression really is multitasking because at the same time you're thinking of something, you're supposed to be thinking of the word for the concept, the spelling of the word, and moving your hand to form the letters. There's layers and layers and layers. And these, of course, increase a working memory load. Now that's a speculation I'll leave out for here. And in terms of pedagogy, remember I said when you really have made something into a habit, you can get kids with ADHD to perform up to speed. Well, frankly, they need more repetition. Now, of course, the repetition also needs to be done as far as is possible in a non-boring way. So repeating things, but repeating them in a slightly different way would be very helpful at different intervals during the week, the semester, the year. I guess you could say reviewing is one way to repeat something, but a little differently. And allowing movement. One of the things we have to do is de-obsess completely about the hyperactivity stuff, which was, prior to 1980, such a big deal. And now we know that it's really very superficial. It may annoy you, but it's not really what's interfering with their learning. So I'm a big fan of placing children who wiggle and jiggle in a position in the room where their wiggling and jiggling is not going to bother somebody else or minimally bother somebody else, but not try to stamp it out. Certainly not use it as an endpoint for any kind of medication decisions. There's been a recent article about children. Big discovery, children need to move around. Did you see that? It was either in the Post or the New York Times, both of which I read, where they said, children need to have more movement. Yeah. Well, yes, all children. This is not even specific, but it's just, in many ways when you think about children with ADHD, a great researcher when I was young and learning from him said, the best way to try to understand children with ADHD is to say, had the child been younger, you wouldn't have considered this a problem. And so they're just very young for grade, young for age. So if somebody else needs to move X amount, they need maybe to move X plus 2 amount. And again, the requirement, you're actually adding another layer of multitasking. If you're asking them to sit still in order to concentrate. Okay, so this is my last year of on the job. So it's kind of nice to put up the names of all the people I've worked with. It's going to be 30 years, and I'm going to be retiring. I've already stopped being my principal investigator. Now I'm just a mentor to other investigators. I closed my clinic in March, and now I'm just a teacher which after all is what the professor is supposed to be. But a lot of times, as you probably know, in academic science and medicine, the word teaching is probably the least valued things of the things people do. I personally value it the highest, so I'm happy to be spending the rest of this year with teaching. And then I'll tell you in advance, before we take some questions, is that I am using my previous clinic days to write a book for parents. This is not a scholarly book. I've had a great deal of difficulty getting a publisher who would take my idea that I wanted to write for parents, not for other professionals. I wanted to just try to express things. You know, I like to tell parents, you know, things about the brain, but using as little jargon as I possibly can. So that's what I'm working on. So just about a year from now, it should be coming out. So I will definitely let you all know, and we'll have a special book signing for lab school. Should we tell them how old I am?
If you want to.
Because I'm retiring when I turn 80. I'm turning 80 in December, so that's why I set 80. Years ago, I set 80 as my target age for retiring. So I'm 79 and change at this point. I have to remember to repeat your questions. So questions, and especially the people over that way, I want to be sure. Yeah. By the way, the reason I have to be very careful is not only because there's a pillar, but if you're a right-handed person, you have a tendency to orient towards the right. So neurologically, you have to be very careful that you make yourself look over to the left, because your natural tendency is not to look over in that direction. So that's why I play favorites with the people over on the left for that reason, knowing what. Okay, the question was, elaborate on this intriguing thing about having debunked visual as important for reading. Why am I so interested in resurrecting it for spelling? Okay, well, first you have to know that in the past 30 years, it has been documented in the brain that there are two kinds of visual perception. And you'll relate to this. A lot of people here are going to be good at one and not at the other, okay? One is the where system, the spatial system, how things relate to each other in space. And the other one is the what system. That is, so for example, if I had a bunch of things on a table and I asked you to look at them quickly and close your eyes and then tell me, could you show me on some other surface how they were positioned? I don't care what they were, but just show me the relative positions. That would be the where system. If, on the other hand, I didn't care where they were and I told you, just tell me what were the items on the table. Now, how many people here think that they are most comfortable with the where system, the spatial navigation system? Raise your hands higher. Okay, and how many people are more comfortable with the what? Okay. There's a slight gender bias, by the way, generally. It's interesting in this population, maybe it's unusual. I saw a lot of women who were more where talented than what talented, but if you get 100 males and females, it's not a statistically significant difference, but if you do sort of a rank order. Anyway, my hypothesis is that when it comes to spelling irregular words, words that don't, and we're just riddled with them in English, let's face it. I mean, English is a horrible language to spell, as any one of your friends who comes here from another country will tell you. You have to have this instantaneous, it's almost like recognizing a friend's face. And you say, oh yeah, that's Sam and that's Charlotte, and you have to be able to say that word looks right, okay? So I think that the what system is a big predictor of the, to a lesser extent, it's important in the sight words, but you don't have to have that level of precision, for when you read in text, in context, not single words, but you might not be processing all the details of the total whatness of every word. You sort of get, the idea of, which there is it, T-H-E-I-R or T-H-E-R-E. You don't really have to worry about that when you're reading so much because from context, you're going to know it doesn't matter. Besides, you're sort of speaking in your head there, so you don't care that much. But if you go to spell it, you have to have that sense of its, almost like, as I said, like face recognition, or those people who are good at, experts at which make of cars. I have trouble using Uber because they tell me which make of car the person, I don't know one make of car from another, big car or little car is about as good as I can do, So, but, people who are experts would be able to tell you exactly, which make of car it was, because, and I think that same system, which allows you to make instantaneous, looks right decisions about spelling is connected with the Watt system. So that's what I'd like to have somebody do research on. Not that I know that how you help that, because it's just, this is such a crazy language. Well, thank God we have all these mechanical assists now with spell check, and so it becomes less of a problem than it was in previous generations. Okay, more questions. I'm still looking to the left for a minute to make sure the left side of me doesn't get neglected. Okay, so the lefties are thinking, so now we'll go over to the right. The way we do this is, I don't want to have to go back to the slide, but it's like, let's say you're performing a discrimination of shapes. You're supposed to press for a square and not for a circle.
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Oh, the question was more about this business about shifting between tasks. And then you go to another task, which is color. Go between red and blue. They have a lot more trouble unless you leave a larger number of seconds in between the tasks. It's like they can't clear out the previous one quick enough. The technical term is your second stimulus onset time has to be much later in kids with ADHD.
So do we know what's going on in the brain?
Oh, it's part of this whole thing of what does the frontal system do? It's kind of like the gear shift in your car, if you have a shift car. And this is one of the terrible things that happens to you over the years. I used to teach that the gear shift of the frontal lobes was ISIS. Yeah, that stood for initiate, sustain, inhibit, and shift. You see. Now, that's why I like Obama used to call it ISIL. So that was all right, because then I could, but everybody else is calling it so I can't really, but I have all these teaching materials where I explain. So these are fundamental operations, if you will, that are done by our frontal executive system, because it runs everything, regardless of what material we're working on. And so apparently that shift function is just balky. And again, it's one of the, this is why I'm so glad we have less of an emphasis on hyperactivity, because starting way back when the word was hyperactivity, I published an article in 1978, which is 2 years before ADHD, called Hyperactive Boys Free of Learning Disability Are Slow in Their Motor Responses. Now, of course, that sounded like, you're crazy, lady. If they're hyperactive, why are you telling me they're slow? But of course, they were slow in doing a designated task. And the hyperactivity refers to their natural state of Brownian motion, just being all over the place. And as I tried to show you, they often they just don't prepare the responses. You can say that it's attention, you can say that it's response preparation, it may be that there's no real daylight between those two terms, because, the Germans talk about the readiness to respond. Now, I guess attention is readiness to respond. So, it gets to be a semantic game, But anyway, the fact is that when other children will go red, green, yellow, blue, they'll just go along in a kind of nice, consistent rhythm with very little variability. They'll get into a rhythm. And the kids with ADHD will have some extremely slow responses, meaning that there are long pauses sprinkled throughout They're not every response, but it's kind of like it's out of control. It's kind of unmodulated. Sometimes it's fast, sometimes it isn't. On average, they have more slow responses. So if you add up all the excessively slow responses, to get from number 1 to number 50, they take longer. But also when they have to switch from one to the other, they also pay a price if you don't slow down for them. So it's just another, think of it as just another kind of lesser efficiency, okay? Or lesser consistency or greater variability. Okay, I'm still looking, okay, nobody's behind the pillars. Oh yes, there is a man right in the back. You know, that's a very good question, because when somebody likes what they're doing, they, and within themselves, release some of the very neurotransmitter that we try to jack up by giving them stimulants in order for them to do boring things. And so they do respond with greater consistency and speed when they are either within themselves producing this neurotransmitter, dopamine, because they, what do we mean when you like to do something? It means it's auto-rewarding. It's rewarding all the time. All the time you're doing it is giving you these little spurts of this reward transmitter, okay? But it's interesting that, of course, most of what we worry about is how do we get them to do the necessary but not necessarily preferable activities, and there I have to tell you, the sad news is that when you do these same tasks on a dose of a stimulant, they approach but do not totally reach their typical peers. It doesn't do 100% of the job. So the boring, non-preferred, necessary tasks are still not horribly, but you know, it's better, but it's not a miracle, okay? So that's the whole trick of he can do it if he wants to, or he can do it if he likes it, or all of those variations which sound like you're moralizing about, you know, you bad person, you're just, you know, doing what comes naturally and nothing else is going to move you. It really is because that's the way everybody is. I mean, let's face it. I mean, you know, I'm sure that I read a lot faster when I'm reading a book I'm interested in than when I'm reading an article that I really feel obliged to read, but I don't really want to, you know. So it's just an exaggeration of a normal tendency. I'm going to take one more left because I want to be sure that I don't miss these people. Well, first of all, let's look at the normative. First of all, I think it's completely different for learning disabilities, for, let's say, dyslexia. Dyslexia, I really have to tell you, I think is a fixed talent deficit. It's a different brain. It's not something you outgrow. It's the way you're built. It's like I said before, who's a what person and who's a where person, you know, who's a language arts person, who isn't. I mean, basically, it's just your natural endowment. And you're gonna work around it because luckily life is not all about those particular skills, you know. I always like to say there are probably as many, if not more, people who have dysmusia. You know, they don't have much of the connections and systems for musicality. We just consider that optional. If we considered all these language arts optional, you know, people would just be a variation on a theme of human diversity, right? Neurodiversity, I think, is the buzzword. But that's why I think they're two different things. But for ADHD, we have an enormous body of work that was done at the NIH, and I think you had, just on the 15th, you had one of that team here. I forget which, was it Shaw? Was it Dr. Shaw who was here on the 15th? Irish guy, no. Anyway, that with the NIH team, I know it was something I wished I had been in town to go to, but the NIH team, because they don't have to keep reapplying for money, they're funded sort of in a long-term way. They've done these long-term studies of the same children followed year after year after year after year. And they show about a 3-year lag in the concrete elements of brain development, like thickness and elaboration of the folding and gyri of the brain. And then they're carrying it on forward to see what happens with the connectivity in the second decade of life. Well, it's in both. Your processing speed is but put it this way, processing speed for everything is a problem with ADHD. It's only for language material that it's a problem with the people that would have purely no comorbidity with ADHD. Do you see what I mean? Mm-hmm. But of course, we always have to remember there's this enormous number of people who have both. Right. That's, it's a not inconsiderable number of people. I would love to know, I don't know if we ever could find out how many people at lab school are comorbid for some degree of ADHD diagnosis, maybe very attenuated or borderline, because I think that it's an added burden. Even if the people have all the luck that they have the best kind of family and school environment and their sort of general deportment is not a problem. But it's about a 3-year lag. But again, I like to reiterate the sort of broad, the structures in question of the frontal lobe in particular have a very prolonged trajectory in human life. For the motor control part, it's the average good enough for life, the plateau where it doesn't develop anymore, is around 15. Okay. And this, I'm talking about you always have to say plus or minus 3, let's say. And the ADHD people are at the -3 level. And for the cognitive things that we've been talking about for executive function, about 25. But for the complete connectivity between the frontal lobe and the emotional brain, what's called the limbic frontal lobe, meaning it's involved with the amygdala and the reward system that's in the underbelly of the basal ganglia. Those full connections are in the early 30s. It's not quite as symmetrical. It would have been nice if I could tell you 15, 25, 35, but it's really 15, 25, 32 for the means, but still. And that's physical evidence that we can actually see in the brain. And so, I mean, that's when you think about how many societies, even today, what is the life expectancy? Some people don't live much longer than their fully mature brain. It's really kind of poignant and awful. I mean, we're lucky that we get to live so long with, a brain that's pretty well in control of itself, So, but there still are a lot of consequences. Even if you say, oh, gee, isn't that nice? ADHD is just a developmental delay. But, translate it that a 5th grader with ADHD is just getting the brain of a 2nd grader. And you think about all the supply discrepancy there, of efficiency, of planning, organizing, self-monitoring, all of those things. And so it does something, in terms of other developmental, emotional, and also it leaves you open to developing some very bad habits. If you're not in an optimal, that's where if the environment can come in and sort of guide you and mentor you, you can normalize a lot. But if you were in a very chaotic environment, you can imagine all kinds of maladaptive things could happen to your brain functioning, even if these things are happening, Okay, now I'll answer some more people over to the right. I didn't mean to be discriminatory, but I just know that I would tend, as I got more tired, to not look over there. Let me get the gentleman in the back. So I think what you're saying is are we just dealing with sort of extreme positions on the bell-shaped curve, or I think the answer is yes. I think the only developmental disability, which is so popular nowadays, that isn't that way, that's really off the curve, is autism. Because you can't say oh, you know, if the child had been younger, this would have been normal. Or you can't say, you know, well, with dyslexia, it's the abundance of a certain trait, a certain talent. That, yeah, I mean, you know, not everybody is a great reader or a fast reader, or, you know, so there's a certain cut point where we say, oh, you're in trouble, you know, as opposed to you're just bringing up the acceptable C- end of the language arts exam, you know what I mean? Yeah, and certainly, but the trouble is, here, I have to editorialize a little bit, because we've shifted the goalposts so much in this country over the past 15 years in particular, where suddenly kindergarten is the new first grade. So we want everybody to do everything earlier. Now this is changing what the bell-shaped curve is. And then you think about the different birthdays kids have. I mean, for example, there was a study in pediatrics 10 years ago that showed that if you were a boy, and there again, this is a big neurodiversity, is young boys and young girls. Girls are 20% more mature in the brain than boys from the time of quickening, that is the time of viability of a fetus, until puberty. Now, thank God, the boys get about an extra 2 years before puberty so they can catch up. So, what?
I thought they never catch up.
That may be because, again, of cultural factors that they don't catch up. You know, that's. But anyway, you take a boy with a birthday in the summer, and he is 4 times as likely to be diagnosed with one of the 2 things we're talking about here, LD or ADHD, as a boy who was born in the winter and is therefore got what I call a comfort cushion on him, because he's 5.5 in kindergarten. But nowadays we're making it very rough, because we're starting in to do a curriculum for which we used to make demands when children were 6 to 6.5. So now we've pushed it a year earlier, and we're getting a lot of, I think, false LD diagnoses just for what you said, because if you just shift the curve, you're going to throw some people down into that lowest little tail of the distribution just by starting everything, and a year is an enormous amount. Well, one of the illustrations of the girls' maturity, I did a lot of research on motor development, and it's a very good marker. It's kind of like, I call it the canary in the coal mine for frontal lobe development, because the motor system is at the back end. The most early developing part of the frontal lobes is motor. That's why I said motor control up to 15, cognitive up to 25. So anyway, the girls' motor, these are timed motor tasks. So the girls in kindergarten, their entire bell-shaped curve fits over boys in the first grade. In other words, there is a 20%, a 1-year advantage to the girls in their development at age 5. So they're more like 6. Now, we've all seen this. This is folk wisdom. We all know it if we have children or grandchildren of both boy and girl varieties. And it's very, very, I have to tell you, I'll share with you. I wrote an invited editorial for the little newsletter IDA puts out, and I have never been met with such complete stonewalling, because they were very unhappy with me. You know how they want to talk about early detection, and I wrote this sort of think piece about, are we in danger of a collision between our zeal for early detection and the fact that we are developmentally inappropriately demanding reading from a significant chunk of children? In other words, we ought to be on the alert to leave some people alone and not detect them because they're simply being asked to do something when they're not ready to do it. Oh, they didn't like that at all. Made me very unpopular with, my people. So.
Like toilet training before the
Oh, but people are doing that too. I made a joke thinking, oh, they're going to start next on toilet training, but then there was an article in the New York Times about people who are engaging people from Asian cultures to show them how to hold their children over receptacles right after meals, and they call that it's just, there's a craziness. People do not want to honor anything about the facts of child development and the variations thereof. You know, there's the boy-girl thing, and then there's especially for academic years, there's the variation in where is your birthday aligned with the academic year. And then there's all the individual things about you, like what is your brain like? You know, what color is your balloon? Remember that thing? And that's there from very early on. What color is your balloon? You know, what's your thing? You know, like I had two sons who were terrific at art, drawing and painting. And one who would refuse, if somebody gave him an assignment in school to draw or paint, he would write a 300-page thing about why he couldn't do it. You know, 300-word thing. But he was musical and the other two weren't. You know, so they had the same father, the same mother, and they had, if it came to the arts, they were just, you know, two were visual arts and one was musical. And they were, you know, so, you know, these variations occur. I mean, we sort of accept it for, it's funny, we are much more accepting of variation in who's talented in math. We use the word talented, but people don't use the word talented about the language arts, but there's no reason why they shouldn't, you know? We apply it when we get to foreign languages. We say, do you have a gift for languages? Well, you know, probably the same person who has a gift for languages has a gift for language, period, you know, and it starts way back. And so, you know, we don't respect in almost any of our school systems all of these different sources of variation in children. And basically everybody should have an individualized educational plan, not just somebody who, you know, can fit into a certain box, you know. Okay, some more questions. You had your hand before. Yes, you really, I think there's a tremendous insensitivity to comprehension deficits on the formal test batteries that people get when they have evaluations. I mean, like the Woodcock, I mean, they're really not, you know, not that it's easy to measure comprehension. I mean, actually, that's one of the components of this research project we had, was to measure comprehension several different ways and find that you probably have to give look for 2 out of 3 to tell you what the reading comprehension is like. Yes, no, in some cases it can. Okay, yeah, there are some, yeah, it's highly variable. In some cases, it's almost entirely that the language part is hunky-dory, but the executive part is what's really lacking, you know. And yes, no. As a matter of fact, when an earlier research project that we started in 1988, we had a population that came in with ADHD, and we, you know, did the Woodcock-Johnson and everything, and they didn't have any learning disabilities that could be, and then they were very highly purified because we had speech language evaluations. You know, they were just ADHD, period, nothing else. And they came back 3 years later, and they had reading comprehension deficits, majority of them. So we know that you can grow into, in other words, a kid can be declared just ADHD, but then can, so to speak, unfortunately, ironically, grow into, but they also tend to have written expression problems, and maybe a little, when they hit long division, then they have math problems. You know, long division is a very, very challenging executive thing. I mean, you've got hypothesis testing, and you have to use old knowledge to check out, and, you know, it's really quite a thing to do long division. So that's another little milestone that they tend, and of course with word problems, kids with ADHD often are not good at plucking out the actual nuts and bolts of what has to be dealt with numerically, you know. So yeah, they have, they grow into it. Not very good. And then of course everybody starts moralizing at them about, you have to take responsibility, and you have to learn to be independent, and if you just keep reminding yourself that you're talking maybe to a 6th grader who does not have the equipment of all the rest of the 6th graders, even with a high IQ, That's what's so amazing, is that kids can, because an IQ test given individually is highly structured for you, it can bring out the best in you, you know, and you can look glorious, but that's not the way you function from day to day, as you know, if you do that kind of coaching. Give me your card afterwards too, because even though I'm not practicing, I'm still getting calls from my old clinic patients about needing to find people to work with their children. Okay, wait a minute, I think I'm going to work this way. I'll go from right to left. I think it's very much, I think unfortunately kids in poverty often have 2 or 3 things happening. You know, they often have mothers who have had poor prenatal care, so they have, you know, what we call epigenetic factors in the womb. And then we've all heard about the lead. I can't believe it. I worked on lead research 25 years ago, and I thought it was a done deal that we all knew we had to get rid of lead. But lead is a big, big, big risk factor and can really become a permanent derailment of normal brain development. And then you have the further epigenetic factor of a lack of a structured, orderly, mentored, well-modeled environment. So all of these things are, you can have, you know, 3 strikes and you're out. You know, it's a terrible problem. And that's why all this, you know, we're going to solve everything by giving more tests, and we make the teachers are better, and you've got to attack the whole beginnings in life of so many of these children. You know, right, as I said, right from you're the only people I know. Did any of you ever hear about the Harlem Project that Geoffrey Canada did? I mean, he did it on a small scale, and admittedly, it would cost, so that he was, I think, funded by the Ford Foundation. He took a catchment area, and he worked with pregnant women and with if he could get the fathers involved, and he did everything from the pregnancy through into the school. And then you get good outcomes. Then you have the normal variation. Some people have ADHD. I mean, some people do have genes and some people have, you know, lesser language endowment. But then you get all this layering and layering and layering of things making everything worse. Enormous problem. She asked about autism, especially at the milder end of the spectrum that we used to be allowed to call it Asperger's, which I still like. But anyway, and dyslexia. And actually, you'll always find some hint that there's some factor biologically that's putting people at risk for some other developmental disability, if you start with any one of them. But it's not a very big chunk. It's not anywhere, it's not even in past single digits, the way the things we're talking about, the ADHD and LD are. It's not a significant overlap. Who else? Okay, I got to go back to the left. Way back there, hi. Well, that's exactly what I was implying, is that we have put on too many blinders and we haven't remembered enough that reading is the tip of the entire language iceberg. And I couldn't agree with you more. I think one of the greatest impediments to really meeting the needs of kids is that often we say, oh, well, they're not good at reading, so they're going to be able to pick up everything in the classroom. But we forget that a lot of them have problems processing a lot of auditory verbal information, maybe not as severe as we can pick up in the reading, but maybe we are really passing by a lot of that. I couldn't agree more. I mean, I was just telling somebody before we convened together that I think the best like individual tutors I've ever known started out as speech language pathologists and then got themselves courses in education in the language arts, and they deal with the whole, what I call the language reading continuum, the spoken language, written language continuum. I agree, and the higher the kids go in the grades in school, the more people tend to forget about and neglect what's happening with their processing language in the lecture format. Definitely. It's tremendously neglected.
Maybe just one more question.
Oh my gosh. Only one? How about just one here and one here? Okay, one left and one right. There's no data on that at all. It's a nice idea, but there's no research I know on it at all. I mean, it's appealing and it sounds good, but you know, it's a starting hypothesis, but it's not, you know, something that's really had any data. The question was about visualization as a way of either enhancing or producing comprehension, I guess. Yeah.
Correlation between visual processing and comprehension of the versa.
I've never seen that at all. No. And I bet you it's variable. I bet you some people it's true and some people it isn't true. But anyway. Well, that's because you could put all of the really good math studies in, you know, like on one little bookshelf, whereas you'd have to use up this whole room for the study. It's been very understudied.
The
Math disability, very understudied, and also because math is even more of a changeable entity over the school years as it moves from, you know, the basic number sense, you know, and the kind of innate number sense that we have in common with many other creatures who don't have a language system, and then we add a language system to it, and then we have procedures, and we have memorizations, and then we have to move into problem solving, and then we get to algebra. I mean, it's a moving target to a much, it doesn't even build in a kind of linear way on preceding steps. It has very diverse feed-ins. So it's much harder to study.
Are there more people that have a reading?
Yes, math disability is, well, you see people who don't do well in math, but it turns out that it really is of much the same lineage as their language problems. They have trouble with the language of math. For instance, they have trouble memorizing multiplication tables, which is just like memorizing the catechism if you have a church with a I mean, you know, there's not much difference. You know, they often have good basic number sense, but they have trouble with all of the very stepwise sequential. And then when you get to algebra, algebra is naked syntax. Algebra is sentences without nouns. It's very linguistic, you know, you know, so you, yes, a lot of them do. You but standalone math disability is very rare, very rare.
So you think that, so if someone has a math disability, you think that they also have a?
Most of them have some language-based learning disability. And it spills over into the formalities of math. But there are very few. I mean, I don't say there's nobody, but it's harder to study when something is relatively rare in pure culture. It's harder to tease out. I saw one fantastic teaching case this year of a girl I think has a genuine, pure math. And interesting enough, you know what else she has? She has severe spatial disorientation. She is terrified about going away to college because she's afraid she won't be able to find her way around on the campus. So we've been talking about different aids to her getting around. So that's called, the formal name for that is dystopographic nausea. You know, because topographical, but she really, and she's really good with language arts, but luckily she's going into musical theater. So our main job was to pull her through the basic math to get out of high school, because she just applied to all these musical theater programs for post-secondary school. She didn't apply even to a regular Bachelor of Arts. Charming, adorable, but the big thing we've been working on is how we're going to get her not to get lost all the time. You know, and the trouble is some of the programs she wants to go to are in New York. And I'm really worried. But you know, you're right. New York is, if you stay in Manhattan, it's pretty, you know.
It's easier for me to navigate than DC. It's
Yes,
avenues
yeah.
and
DC,
streets.
we have too many diagonals and circles. Yeah, exactly. You're right. You're
It's
right.
avenues and
You're
then
right.
streets going east to west.
And frankly, if you use the subway, you just need to know what stop and whether to go to the back or the front of the train. You know what I mean? If you use the subway and somebody just tells you this is how you get from here to there, you take this, you know, the L train, and you go. This is the name of the station and the name of the. Yeah, you can kind of, you know. But anyway, she's very rare. I mean, she's what I call a teaching case, because she just had those two things, and I could hypothesize that she has something wrong with her right parietal lobe, because that's where it would fit to have this difficulty with basic numerosity. It's a very complicated subject, and very few people are doing research on it. They keep on putting out requests for applications from the NIH, and they just don't get enough people to be in a competition, because it's so rare, and it's complicated in addition.
Won't she have to take, Meryl Streep said she wanted to be a music major when she went to Yale, but she,
Oh, yeah,
too
no,
much music,
yeah,
and
yeah.
she couldn't- too much math.
Yeah.
And
No, this girl just wants to do singing and dancing of musical theater. She doesn't want to do anything really theoretical, believe me. I don't think she can even read music. Okay.